usually my podcast, I'd probably say 8 months out of the year, it has no advertisement at all. But that way, when I do place it in, it's on every single episode, and it's there just for a short time to really pique someone's interest because they're like, this is different. What is this?
Yeah, that's a really good option. Yeah. I like the dynamic insertion at the very beginning too, because that's when you've got them hooked. They're there to listen. So you may as well. Yeah, that's a really good option. Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jodi Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. Here's the first part of my conversation with Alex Sanfilippo. My next guest is an entrepreneur who is the CEO and founder of PodPros, a software company focused specifically on the podcasting industry. He's also a podcast host of the top-rated podcast, Podcasting Made Simple, and a leading educator in podcasting. His name is Alex Sanfilippo, and his groundbreaking business ventures have definitely shaped the world of podcasting in a big way. If you're looking to make more out of your podcast while also retaining your sanity, Alex has a few ideas. As always, if you have questions for my guest, you're welcome to reach out through the links in the show notes. If you have questions for me, visit audiobrandingpodcast.com, where you'll find a lot of ways to get in touch. You can also join regular Clubhouse chats in the Power of Sound House at 2 p.m. Eastern every Wednesday. Plus, subscribing to the newsletter will let you know when the new podcasts are available and what the newest Clubhouse rooms will be about. And if you're getting some value from listening, the best ways to show your support are to share this podcast with a friend and leave an honest review. Both those things really help, and I'd love to feature your review on future podcasts. You can leave one either in written or in voice format from the podcast's main page. I would so appreciate that. And now, here's my conversation with Alex Sanfilippo. Hey, well, welcome, Alex. I have been looking forward to this a lot, actually, and we had to put off the first one, so.
Yeah, Jodi, we had to put it off because I absolutely love your voice, and probably everybody says that, right? And I just knew, I was just getting home from a trip, and for some reason after I'm on a plane, I feel like I just sound like a little nasally or something like that. I'm like, this would be acceptable for any podcast except for Jodi's audio branding. I'm like, and so I just emailed him like, can we please, like, I just don't want to be that intimidated. So anyway, I'm back to 100%. I sound as good as I can. I don't sound Jodi level,
you
but you
sound
know what?
Great. And thank you. I appreciate it. I am always appreciative of people who pay attention to the sound and think about that. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And I'm honored to be here, by the way. I love listening to your show. And so as a
Thanks.
listener myself, it's an honor to be in this seat today. So thank you.
Thank you. We just had our 200th episode yesterday. So yeah, I'm
It's amazing.
Yeah, kind of thrilled about that. So yeah, hard to believe I made it, but yeah, I'm sure you get that kind of conversation a lot, actually, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I can just tell you off the top of my head because I just looked at these numbers. So at the time of recording this, you have just under a 6% chance of making it to 200 episodes. So congratulations, you're here.
Yeah, who knew? Who knew it would happen? Yeah, I don't know. But I always like to ask people when they come on this show, and it's a wonderful kind of intro to how you got into enjoying audio. So do you have an early memory of how sound moved you?
Yeah, maybe a little bit unique. I'll try not to get emotional about it. But when I was born and really young, I had an issue where I wasn't able to hear, or at least hear very well. I was very young, so my parents were hearing this from doctors that I just wasn't responding to things from like an actual like sound level, right? And I thank God for this, that for healing. It was through chiropractics. They were able to do a series of adjustments over time that actually enabled me to be able to hear a completely normal and at a full functioning level, which again, I thank God for. I'm super thankful for that. I didn't have to get any tubes in my ears, which the original idea was they were going to do a set of different surgeries and stuff like that to try to correct the thing. But my parents were like, let's pray for this kid and take him to chiropractors and see what happens, right? Okay. And so for me, that was like my initial, I guess, hearing sound, right? And beyond that, at a young age, I can remember I grew up in the early 90s, I guess, is when I was like that was when I was a kid, right? I was in my prime, right? And I can remember just enjoying audio so much. And it was actually tapes back then. So
Of
I remember my
course.
mom driving us around, me and my brothers, and we listened to something called Adventures in Odyssey, which is like these
Ah,
little adventure things. And I remember as a kid, like visualizing it, right? Like setting the scene, get the scenarios, but
yep.
just thoroughly enjoying the element of creativity myself. And I can actually tell you that as a kid, TV made me much less creative whenever I had the opportunity to watch it. So much so that my mom was like, listen, you're going to go outside and play, right? But whenever it was audio only, I would create the visions myself. And I think that a lot of my creativity is owed to those moments. So that's kind of my background with sound and how it's really moved me.
I love that. Yeah. Katie Lee was involved in that, right? She's a colleague and friend. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know anybody who was involved in it. I was just a little guy, but I do know the name. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And they do really good work. So yeah, it's wonderful to see that as a memory coming up. Yeah. I grew up in the 80s. So
I was born in '88, so I'm there kind of, right?
yeah, that was my first year of university.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what? I was trying to look out for you, Jodi. So
I appreciate it. It's okay. I still remember the Saturday morning cartoons of the 80s and oh my goodness. But yeah, jingles were a big thing. And I think they were a lot less of a thing by the time you were coming around listening to things like that. I think jingles were much bigger years before. But yeah, there's sound. It has that way of creating a theater of the mind that I think a lot of us really thrive on creatively. So you're right that it's an interesting idea that unfortunately television does not inspire us to the same thing.
no, not at all. And that's why I will always have a respect for it. So.
Yeah. So what got you into the interest for podcasting? Because that must have come from somewhere. Did you have a radio background? Did
No,
anything like
actually, as a matter of fact, I got into podcasting as a listener first, which is probably the story for everybody, right? But I'll never forget it. And I was late to the podcasting game. I don't know what year it was, but I was working in the aerospace industry, and before anyone gets super excited, I wasn't an astronaut, skydiver, or fighter pilot. Like I was just a guy behind a computer, right? Anyway, one of my departments I was overseeing at this time was the shipping and receiving department, where we were actually shipping aircraft parts and stuff. And I was a very social leader in the company, right? So I was always going around. So I'm like walking through, and I can hear them listening to something really loud. And I assumed that there was something on the screen. So like I walk around the corner and I immediately look at like the bigger screen in shipping and receiving. I was like, "What you're all watching something?" They're like, "No, we're listening." I was like, "What is this? Like, why did you turn off the screen?" They're like, "Well, no, it's just a podcast." I was like, "What the heck is a podcast?" They're like, "It's just audio. It's just a conversation between two people on audio." And I remember I literally said, "Huh, that's a pretty dumb idea. That'll never work." And the funny thing is, I was in shipping and receiving for about 20 minutes, and I started listening to it while they were like kind of working. I was like looking around at some stuff, and I was like, "Hey, who are these guys? Hey, where would you find this?" Right? Like I started asking those questions, and like for a guy who thinks this is going away, you seem pretty interested. And it's because I actually got into the conversation. I'm like, well, they're actually talking about something I'm kind of curious about myself. And so that same day, somebody showed me on my iPhone that I had something called podcasts on there, and a little purple icon.
Yep.
And like everybody, I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that was there, right? So I click it, and they told me what show it was, and I started listening to it. I kind of like figured out where they were at and started listening. And so the rest of the day, it was in my ears. And I'll tell you what, Jodi, from that moment on, I was like, I love this. I hope it never goes away. And
You
that was
were
my
hooked.
introduction to podcasting.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you were hooked. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then what got you into the whole creating software for podcasters then? Because I know I'm a member of Podmatch, and I know that there's a whole bunch of other things in your ecosystem that you've put together. So, I mean, again, there's got to be a progression from being an avid listener to, and you have a podcast of your own, of course. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah. Well,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
I did listen for a few years, and I discovered that there were podcasts about podcasting even back then. I think the year was maybe 2013, maybe is what it was. And I was like, wow, there's podcasts teaching people how to podcast, right? Now, I'll never forget, like the first one I listened to was Duct Tape Marketing. And John, I can't think of his last name right now, but John was interviewing a guy named John Lee Dumas, JLD, Entrepreneurs on
Yes.
Fire, as we know him, right? And he was newer to podcasting. He was just sharing how he's like, I started a show and I'm doing really well now. And again, so I think John started in 2012 and this is 2013. So it's a year after that. And I just remember hearing that. And at that point I was in blogging and WordPress specifically, I was kind of working on those type of things and I had so many questions about how to do this, right? And I got tired of writing. I don't know, Jodi. I just feel it was a lot. I'm like, man, this question, I don't even really know how to unpack it. And now I'm going to spend a week writing a good blog post on this. I don't really want to write about this anyway. So I just started a little podcast for people that were working in WordPress. And it was just me talking about, hey, a bunch of people have been asking about this, and they were 10, 15-minute episodes. I think I recorded them in my car, because I thought that was a good idea.
It's not a horrible idea, honestly, because there
have
are
a car running.
Well, okay,
or
probably not.
Sitting in a parking lot next to a highway. I was like, no one's going to notice. And now I think back, I'm like, what was I thinking? The car is loud. I have the AC just blaring at full blast, and there's a highway. Anyway, so yeah, maybe it's not a bad idea. Maybe there's some best practices.
If you turn off the car and you're off of the highway and yeah, it's an insulated area. The reason I say that is because I know a lot of voice talent have recorded in their car when they're on the road and they need a place to record because it's an insulated area. So if you go into the back seat of your car and you just clamp your microphone onto one of the seats and, you have maybe a little bit of padding around you, it actually is not a bad environment to record in. But yeah, you probably don't want the AC blasting and you don't want lots of cars going by. And yeah, that's,
right.
Yeah.
I needed you in 2013, obviously. So anyway, that was my introduction to it, and I ended up not doing well with that show. I couldn't keep up with it. My focus was blogging at that point.
Sure.
Fast forward just a little bit of time, I actually started a multi-author blog that was faith-driven. So for me, I already kind of hinted at the beginning here, but I'm a follower of Jesus, and I wrote about that. Just really how Jesus could help you through tough times. It's really the focus of it.
Sure.
And same thing, I like to write. I had fun doing that, but there was always more things coming in. So I started this time a podcast that I actually did in my home and figured out how to do some soundproofing stuff, right? It was mostly pillows and blankets and stuff like that.
It works.
And it works. Yeah, it got me by. People were always like, what gear are you using? I was still only using my iPhone. That's it. I didn't know anything about this stuff. And thankfully I have friends now like you that tell me, hey, Alex, this is a microphone. It makes you sound better. Because I didn't know that, right? I was like, oh, well, what do you plug it into, right? Where does the sound go? Anyway, so I got into it. That was probably, 2013 was my failed attempt, my pod fade year, if you will, right? And then 2014 is when I started this other show that actually did exceptionally well. It really took off because it was connected to a blog that was already pretty big. There was 100 and some odd authors for it, and I was the voice of it because I was the podcast behind it. And just fell in love with the medium. And fast forward a few more years, I think 2018, I started a podcast called, I wanted to get into entrepreneurship myself. So I started one called Creating a Brand. And it was about the art of creating a brand. How do you do this? And at this point, I was still in that corporate job, the aerospace job, where I wasn't a skydiver, astronaut, or fighter pilot, but still a really fun gig. And so I decided to start this show, and I was like, I'm going to learn to become an entrepreneur by talking to people who have successfully left a 9-to-5 job to pursue this passion full time. And what does that look like? How do they do it? Right? I'm just going to have those conversations. And that show, like the one before it, just did exceptionally well from day one. And for that, I am so thankful. A lot of that is timing. A lot of it was branding, right? It was kind of all the things put together, and just so thankful. And I learned two things from that podcast, Jodi. Number one, how to become an entrepreneur. And for anyone who's curious, I feel like I have to give the very quick version. This is no disrespect to the 158 guests I interviewed on that, but I'm going to way oversimplify it. But step one, find an area of passion. Step two, get into the community of that area of passion. Step three, solve a problem for that community. And step four, find a problem that they're struggling with. And step four is to solve it.
I really appreciate you being here. Know anyone that you think would make a great guest for this podcast? Someone who works in sound on behalf of clients? Please do get in touch. I'd love to hear about them. Your recommendations are always super helpful. And now back to the show.
So find passion, community, problem, solution, and just do that as fast and simple as you possibly can. And so I learned that, right? But I also learned that I wanted it to be in the podcasting industry. And so that's ultimately what led me to launch my company, Podmatch, which you hinted at a little while ago, which is a service that connects guests and hosts for interviews, works like a dating app, but instead of connecting you for dates, it connects you for podcast interviews. But that all kind of came through that journey.
I love that description.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. It's one of those, again, going back to branding, I've just learned about simplicity, right? Like I love audio. I love words. What I don't love is when somebody takes 10 minutes to explain something that I still don't get, right? The second I say it's like a dating app that connects you for podcast interviews instead of dates, everybody says, oh, wow, that's really cool. They immediately get it, right?
Yep.
And I always say, people are like, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I always say, but the right words are priceless. It's just a matter of discovering those right words. And when you discover them, man, is that powerful.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. It's also in the delivery of how you share those words too.
That's why I listen to you, Jodi, because you helped me with that. I talk fast. I'm a little bit robotic, but you've helped me a little bit. I'm like, man, my cadence. So listen, when Jodi says it, like, you can deliver the worst news on the planet and it sounds beautiful. And I'm like, but how nice did it sound when she said that tragic thing that happened, right? Like, I want that, Jodi. That's what I'm here for.
I am not hearing any robotic here, so you're doing just fine.
Thank you.
So have you used advertising in your podcast, and is that something that you suggest that people do? Or when it comes to monetization, I know that a lot of people are so into this. Like, the first thing they want to do when they do get into podcasts is they want to make money. They want to make sure that their podcast makes money. And I personally have always been of the thought that isn't the first thing you should be thinking about. And you now also have another podcast that teaches about podcasting, right? So from that podcast, you moved on to the entrepreneurial one. You moved on to another podcast, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, those two things really go hand in hand, because my podcast now it's the same feed. So, by the way, Creating a Brand is the first 158 episodes of what's now called Podcasting Made Simple. And that's probably my forever show. I love it. Super fun. So Podcasting Made Simple, it's for podcast guests and hosts, just helping them further their craft and level up on either side of the mic. And initially, Jodi, like you're saying, like, I was like, okay, do we do ads on this? Because we have a really good niche, right? A really good focus. And that's one of the keys to making a sponsorship or ad work. But something I started realizing is people have a really hard time remembering what's discussed on a podcast if it goes in a bunch of different directions. And because of that, I was like, well, hold on. If we have a sponsor, let's just say a microphone company, right? That's going to be our sponsor. But then I also want to promote our virtual event and talk about Podmatch. Now I'm telling people 3 separate things. Like, are they going to remember that?
Yeah, that's a lot.
And it turns into a lot. And what I've realized is, especially my audience, and I guess every audience is a little bit different, but I don't think this is too uncommon. My audience is listening while they're cleaning, cooking, driving, working out, doing some chore, right?
Totally.
I think that's the beauty of audio and what makes it so retainable by us, right? Like, we retain it so well because if you think about it, like, we remember things better if we're doing something else at the same time. There's a lot of science behind that I'm not going to get into. But for me, I'm like, I don't want them to be vacuuming their house and be like, okay, Alex said the microphone uses this. He said he has a virtual event coming up, but he also has, what was his company called? He's a company too, right? So I just decided, you know what? We're not going to ever run ads. We're only going to promote our one thing at that one time that matters most to us. And we're going to tell people, this is the singular direction we want you to go in if you enjoyed this content. And that for us has worked night and day different than having multiple directions for people to go.
Very interesting. So now, instead of taking money from an advertiser to put on your podcast, you're promoting your own things. So basically advertising for yourself, which I think is a really good way to look at this, in that it can be a marketing vehicle for people if they have something that they're putting together, like an event, or they have a PDF they want people to have a look at, or they have a coaching session or something. Promoting your own stuff on your podcast can help narrow that focus, right? As you're saying.
Absolutely. I think I have a couple of thoughts here. Like, if you do have a product or service of your own, I always say that's what you should be promoting. Example, though, if you don't, and you have a really niche, solid podcast, you can go find a real sponsor, not just advertisers that'll talk about getting your car rotated or a new mattress, right? But
we've all heard the mattress,
right? Yes, we have. Or the Shave Club one, right? Like
Yes.
we've heard them, right? And it's like,
Hello
okay,
Fresh.
yes. Here's the thing. We all need to sleep. We all need to eat. Most of us like to shave, right? Like that's valid, but it's not really fitting the niche. And here's a great example of this. Harry Durham, who is someone that I think you probably know as well. Podcast Junkie is Junkies is his podcast. And he launched a podcast called Vertical Farming. And the whole idea was if you live in a small place, how to do vertical farming. And at that point, before he launched the podcast, there was only one company selling kits for vertical farming. It was very expensive. Before he launched the show, they gave him $50,000 saying,
wow.
We're going to be your only sponsor. And here's the thing. He didn't have a product. He was passionate about vertical farming in your home, right? And so that company, they're like, listen, if one person, I don't know what it was, if like 5 people convert a month, you're the only podcast about it, number one, so everyone's going to listen to it. 2, if we convert 5 a month, we're profitable. And it was like a no-brainer. So every month he was making just this, for podcasting, what seems to be a crazy amount of money, because he figured out how to not try to sell a mattress and make $5 here and there, but instead saying, hey, I bet more than 5 people will listen, and I bet some of them are going to want to buy your vertical farm because it's the only one, and I'm the only podcast. Let's make this thing work. And so I'm not saying to avoid the advertisement, just find a true sponsor if you don't have your own product or service. But if you do, you're always going to do better selling your own thing. And I think it's better not to muddy the water.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah. Even when it came to any advertising online, I had a songwriting resource back in like 95. It started, and for a long, long time. And very specifically, it was geared towards songwriters, not necessarily musicians or gigging people. It was like, this was a songwriting website. And so it had people who were sponsors like Berkeley, like the School of Music and, like this kind of stuff. So it was very, very specific as far as the sponsors were concerned, and the songwriting contests and things like that. And being a gatekeeper in that kind of an environment is, I almost kind of felt like it was a solemn duty.
Right. Yeah. That's a good way to think of it, actually. I respect that.
Yeah. Because, you can take advertising money from anyone, but is it going to help them, and is it going to help your audience? So really consider that, I guess, before you're going to decide who your sponsors are going to be, if you're going to have sponsors. You may as well make it worth everyone's time. You don't want to waste your listeners' time either. So,
another thing right along this point that I think is you don't want to waste your listeners' time. I love that you said that. And for me, I kind of tested, like, where does an ad work for me, by the way? Like, and it's my own stuff, so I shouldn't really call it an ad. It's me talking about what I have going on.
Sure.
I started using dynamic insertion, which maybe some people will be familiar with. They're checking this out. Maybe some won't. It basically allows you to add a separate audio file into a podcast. So usually it's like beginning, middle, end, or some you can actually place where it is. What I found works best is before my introduction. And I don't always turn it on. I only turn on when I have something. So if you're a weekly listener, you might go 2 months just hearing the roll into the little intro jingle, right? And then like into the actual episode. But occasionally you'll hear me say, hey, Alex here. I want to let you know we've got our next virtual event coming up on this date at this time. I'd love to see you there. Go to podtalks.fm to grab your ticket. And now let's get into the episode. And then it rolls into the intro. It's now telling them, like, this is the podcast, and they're hearing something. Wait, I'm not used to hearing that. What is that, right? It's like, think about, like, I don't know if you had, like, a favorite show growing up or anything like that, but some TV shows, I remember this, like, they changed the intro at some point. So you hear the music, which you're used to hearing. You wouldn't even look at the TV yet because you're like, I already know what this is. And they change, be like, what's going on here? Right? Like, what is this? Yeah. And it sounds kind of the same, but it's not really the same. I found that works so well. And then right after the event date, I just cut that off. And then it's back to normal for a month or whatever until I have something else to talk about. And that's what I have found has worked the best for me. Keep it really short, straight to the point. So usually my podcast, I'd probably say 8 months out of the year, it has no advertisement at all. But that way, when I do place it in, it's on every single episode, and it's there just for a short time to really pique someone's interest because they're like, this is different. What is this?
Yeah, that's a really good option. Yeah, I like the dynamic insertion at the very beginning too, because that's when you've got them hooked. They're there to listen, so you may as well. Yeah, that's a really good option. And as far as elements of a podcast are concerned, do you feel that there are elements that all good podcasts should have in them that, you just encourage people to continue doing on a regular basis?
Yeah, I might not have data on most of this stuff, and you could probably actually speak to someone better than I could, Jody. But like the first thing I think of is having some sort of intro jingle song.
Sure.
It doesn't need to be long. Sometimes brief is better, but something that people can remember you by, right? I mentioned TV shows a second ago, so I'll do another one. I know it's about audio, but I'm mentioning TV shows. But the intro to The Office, I can hear that song anywhere, and immediately I'm like, that show makes me laugh so much, right? Like everything in that show is funny.
Yeah.
But like I don't have to watch it. I just have to hear it, and I can recall all these different lines that I've heard from it that I love that I'll probably repeat on the spot right there. You want people to associate some sort of sound because sound is so powerful with what you are and what you do. I can remember some people have told me, they're like, man, whenever your podcast comes on, I kind of like dance a little bit in the car whenever it's like coming on. And they're like, I'm like, that's great. It means you remember me. You're excited about it, right? I didn't make the music, by the way. I don't want to take credit for that. But I do think that it's very important to have something that separates you. And I'm also all for getting straight to the point as fast as possible, but not so much so that you miss that really key thing. And Jody, you probably can speak to the psychology of that or the science behind it, because I know it's there. But that's an important point. Am I right in saying that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's, we remember audio so much more. That's why this whole audio branding thing has become kind of important, because advertising that isn't memorable is failed advertising. And advertisements want to be memorable, and anything wants to be memorable, really. When you're doing a podcast and all it is audio, you want people to remember where they are and who they're listening to, right? That's kind of important.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think that's one of the important elements, though. I think that that's a really important one. Beyond that, this is like maybe just some etiquette, but say the name of the show and say who you are every time. There's a lot of podcasts I listen to, and some I really like, so I wanted to like reach out to the host, but they never say their name. And maybe that's intentional, but I hear it more times than it is probably intentional, right? There's probably the rare case where it's like, hey, I want to keep my identity kind of like out of this. But occasionally, maybe that's the case, but every other time I'm like, why? Like, hey, podcaster, like, I really like your show, buddy, right? Like, I don't know what to say. And I believe that listeners, they want to feel like they know you.
Yeah.
And so, like, the thing is, like, I listen to audio branding outside of me just being a guest on it, which again, honored to be here. But I don't say, yeah, I listen to audio branding. I say I listen to Jodi's podcast, Audio Branding. Right? But if I just say, yeah, there's this lady and she has a show called Audio Branding. Don't know her name, so I'm not very connected with her, right? So I'm just saying, like, it's important for us to do that as podcasters, to build that know, like, trust with our listenership.
Yeah, definitely. And I totally agree with that.
Do you want to sound your absolute best when you're being interviewed on a podcast or when you're hosting your own show? I have a podcast episode and free downloadable worksheet called Sounding Your Best as a Podcast Guest off of the audiobrandingpodcast.com main page. Just click on the little square graphic to the left of the player displaying my podcast trailer. It gives you some comprehensive suggestions for where to start or for improving the sound you already have, including the type of microphones to consider and why, ideas for soundproofing your recording environment, and suggestions on how to get the best sound when you're being remotely recorded on services like Riverside FM or Squadcast. Don't let bad audio quality hold you back from being the best podcast guest or host you can be. And of course, if you happen to need voiceover for your intro and outro, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to help. And now, back to the podcast.
I don't think, and you probably can speak to this as much as I can, I don't think people listen to a podcast because of the subject matter necessarily. They may continue listening for that, but if the host is not interesting to listen to, or if you can't get to know that host in some way, they're probably not going to stick around, because, you know, it's about you, you know, it's about the host and what they bring to the comfortability, I guess, the being able to relax into that moment when you're spending time listening. And that's an important aspect of all of this, I'm sure. So, and again, like you, I don't have any numbers to back that up, but I would just assume that people listen for personality almost more than they do for subject matter.
Yeah, and you know, that's a great reason to talk about this next point here, which is to be yourself. Like, I get that we have like a bit of a podcasting or voice that we develop, right? So we might be a little bit different in just a normal conversation, which on the mic you have to be, because if I talk to my normal cadence on a mic, it'd be a little bit more monotone, right? But in person, it's just different. I remember the first time I got on stage, someone's like, hey, Alex, you need to be like, you need to feel like you're being over the top, because to everyone else, it looks like you're still not even close to that.
Yeah.
And Jodi, that was the most uncomfortable thing. I'm like, so I need to like throw my arms more and say things louder. I'm like, yeah. I rewatched the video. I'm like, you're right. I felt like I was being really animated and I still look a little stiff, right? Like, and so you might have to develop that a little bit. But my least favorite thing that I've had happen is when I'm a guest on a podcast or I'm the host, and the person on the other side of the mic, we hit record, and at first they're like, oh, man, I can't wait. This is going to be so much fun. Can't wait, right? And then they get on, they're like, hey, Alex, it's good to be here with you today. And you're like, wait a minute, where'd Mr. Cool go, right? Where'd the fun guy go? And I think that the less we associate ourselves with who we truly are, the more disconnect we're building with our listenership. People can see right through that, even if you have trouble doing it. People are smart. Podcast listeners are, I mean, if you look at the data on podcast listeners, they're actually some of the smartest people on the planet that are listening. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, but we've got to learn to develop our voice and to truly be ourselves through it.
Oh, yeah. Authenticity is so important these days. Even in voiceover, this has been a trend that I've been noticing in what I do for many years now. You can't be selling to people anymore. You're having a conversation, right? People don't want to be sold to. They want to be discussed with. They want to have a discussion,
Right. Yeah, that's such a good way to say it, Jodi. I love that.
Yeah, so it's a trend that I think is in many different places right now, and definitely when it comes to audio, authenticity is huge. So yeah, and I don't do any stage presentations, so I can only imagine how difficult that is for you. And I am super impressed that you do that. So way to go, first of all.
Podcasting has actually helped a lot. Like I've learned to be good on stage through what I'm doing here, and so I really. I don't mean to say like I owe it to podcasting, but it has really just helped me with my confidence so much, my ability to actually deliver something meaningful, because you're on the clock, right? So even here, like I can't ramble on for 15 minutes every time you ask me something, as much as I might like to. I can't, right? Because
well, you could, but yeah, I might cut you off, but you could.
There's another great point, by the way. Keep your episode duration somewhat similar. Like if you don't tell your listeners, hey, every week we're gonna be here for 30 minutes, and then make it 2 hours, right? Imagine that, right? Like, if they're listening on their way to work and they're like, oh, I got a quarter through this episode, I usually finish them. What happened, right? Like that inconsistency is really not healthy to do long term. It's probably like one of my last ideas there. I mean, could come up with more. I'm sure you could as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really important one as well. Is just consistent episode releases and consistent duration of episodes as well.
This has been part 1 of our interview. I hope you'll tune in next week for part 2. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time.